Silence is not absence, it is presence stripped of demand. When a woman withdraws her attention, she does not disappear. She becomes a mirror so empty that a man is forced to see himself. What he once believed was love now trembles under the weight of uncertainty. And uncertainty, to the ego, feels like death. He senses it before he understands it, the slow unraveling of control. The calls that once summoned response now echo without return. The texts he delays reading are met with the same delay, but colder. In the void where validation once lived, a quiet dread grows. Has he been erased or merely revealed? To the masculine ego, ignoring is not an act of cruelty. It is an existential disruption. The woman who once reflected his desirability now reflects nothing. Her silence becomes a psychological eclipse, his sense of worth darkened by her absence of reaction. He does not yet realize that the fear she awakens is not about her. It is about the self he projected into her gaze. The male psyche, shaped through both instinct and conditioning, often seeks recognition to affirm existence. A man learns early that power is proven through response, to conquer, to be chosen, to be needed. When that circuit breaks, the animus, his inner masculine identity, fractures. The feminine no longer orbits him. She withdraws into her own gravity. And suddenly, his entire emotional architecture trembles. What he feels as rejection is, in truth, reflection. Her silence returns him to the silence within himself, the one he never learned to inhabit without fear. The fear of being unseen is not new. It belongs to the boy who learned that performance was love, that attention was proof. In her absence, that boy resurfaces, unmasked beneath the armor of confidence. Every projection has its collapse. In the beginning, he idealized her not as she was, but as the vessel for his anima, the internal feminine he unconsciously disowned. Her warmth became his redemption, her softness his sanctuary, her attention his validation. Through her, he found temporary union with the part of himself he had long suppressed. But projection, like all illusions, demands energy to sustain, and silence withdraws that energy. When she turns away, the mirror breaks. The image he loved dissolves, and what remains is the raw, unmediated truth of himself, unchosen, uncertain, unseen. The ego panics because the anima, once externalized through her, has retreated back into the unconscious. This is the true terror of being ignored, not the loss of her presence, but the confrontation with the void she reveals inside him. He tells himself she is manipulative, cold, punishing. But those words are defenses, rationalizations to protect the ego from annihilation. He cannot yet see that her silence exposes his dependency, that the wound was never inflicted by her but awakened through her. He is not suffering her absence. He is suffering his own fragmentation. The unconscious does not speak in logic. It speaks through reaction. The tension he feels, the oscillation between anger and yearning, is the psyche's way of forcing awareness. In that turmoil, the shadow begins to stir. Beneath his resentment lies grief. Grief for the part of himself that he handed over in exchange for being seen. He doesn't miss her asterisk attention. He misses the reflection of his own significance. And yet that pain is not punishment, it is initiation. Because the woman who ignores does not destroy him, she dismantles the illusion that she ever completed him. She becomes the crucible in which his false identity burns. Silence, to the unconscious, is alchemical fire. It consumes every distortion that cannot withstand solitude. You may think you are simply withdrawing, but what you are doing at the level of archetype is calling his shadow forth. You are refusing to be his mirror. You are forcing him to confront his disowned feminine, the anima he has buried beneath ambition, control, and pride. You are teaching him, without a word, that love without awareness becomes possession. And in that space, something ancient occurs. The collapse of projection, the end of the dream where one is the savior and the other, the reflection. What remains is the potential for consciousness, if he is willing to descend. If he can face the silence not as abandonment but as invitation. The invitation to meet the woman not as symbol but as equal, not as mirror but as mirror breaker. Because to ignore a man is not to reject him. It is to remove the illusion that he can exist only through being seen. It is to remind him that awareness, once externalized, must return inward. And when he finally stops chasing her echo and begins to listen to the silence, that is where individuation begins. He thought her silence was the end of love. It was only the beginning of truth. The fear that rises in him is older than language. It is not about her voice, her absence, or even her disinterest. It is the collapse of his psychic order. For the masculine ego, built on direction, purpose, and conquest, to be ignored is to lose orientation. The compass no longer points north. The goal disappears. He is left alone with himself, and that is the one landscape he never learned to navigate. He begins to oscillate between control and confusion. He tells himself he doesn't care, then checks again. He decides to move on, then finds himself replaying her last words. The cycle is not emotional weakness. It is psychological gravity. The ego resists dissolution, and silence is the solvent. What dies first is not love, it is illusion. Carl Jung wrote that the anima, the inner feminine of a man's psyche, is the bridge to the unconscious. When a man projects that anima onto a woman, he gives her the keys to his interior world without realizing it. Her affection becomes access, her attention becomes order. Through her, he feels connected to life, emotion, and meaning. But when she withdraws, that bridge collapses. The unconscious floods in. And with it, the shadow. The shadow is not evil. It is merely what the ego cannot yet accept. In this silence, he meets his own dependency, the way he used her validation to postpone his self-confrontation, the way desire disguised avoidance, the way pursuit replaced presence. He begins to see that what he called asterisk connection was, in part, control. The need to secure her attention was not about love, it was about survival. And yet, silence transforms what argument cannot. When the feminine energy withdraws, it stops participating in his defenses. She no longer softens his projections or absorbs his reactivity. She becomes the stillness that forces truth to rise from beneath his rationalizations. In her absence, the psyche turns inward, the only direction left. He may try to provoke her. The ignored man often swings between charm and cruelty, between yearning and accusation. This is not malice. It is the unconscious attempt to restore psychic symmetry. Attention becomes the bargaining chip of the wounded ego, see me, even if you must hate me. The ego would rather be demonized than forgotten, because hatred at least confirms existence, but silence confirms nothing. And so it terrifies. If he could see through the panic, he would recognize that she has not taken power from him. She has revealed where he never had it. His authority depended on her participation. His confidence lived through her reflection. When that disappears, he faces the truth, that what he called masculine strength was often externalized validation. Real sovereignty requires solitude, a confrontation with the self that needs nothing mirrored back. But few men are taught how to hold that void. They are taught to act, to fix, to win, not to listen to the silence within. To lose response feels like losing meaning. Yet meaning is not given by another. It is born in the capacity to remain conscious amid emptiness. That is the initiation her silence carries, not punishment, but passage. And in the deeper layers, this pattern is not personal. It is archetypal. The withdrawing woman becomes the great mother archetype in her detached form, not nurturing, but impersonal, demanding individuation. She refuses to feed the ego's dependency and instead invites the man to find his own inner feminine, his intuition, his feeling, his capacity to contain. Her silence is the threshold between boyhood and consciousness. You, the silent one, may not realize the power of what you are embodying. Your stillness is not rejection. It is a boundary between illusion and truth. You become the mirror that no longer flatters, the one that no longer sustains projection. In your refusal to engage, you are not withholding love. You are insisting on awareness. That is a rarer form of love, one that demands the death of ego before the birth of authenticity. He will resist it, every ego does. He will label you cold, detached, superior. He must, because to admit otherwise would expose his dependence. But beneath the anger, something else begins to stir: curiosity. The masculine psyche cannot stay in fear forever. It must understand the threat. And in trying to understand, it begins to awaken. He wonders why this silence has such power, why her absence cuts deeper than conflict, why the woman who says nothing becomes unforgettable. It is because silence is not passive, it is reflective. It returns projection to its sender. It forces the psyche to meet itself without disguise. And slowly, awareness begins to replace reaction. What began as fear starts to look like revelation. He begins to see that the attention he craved was the attention he never gave himself. That her silence was not cruelty, but clarity, a mirror that no longer lied. This is how transformation begins, not with understanding, but with disintegration. The ego breaks before the self is born. There comes a point when resistance no longer works. The ego exhausts. Tethered from its own defenses, begins to loosen its grip. The anger fades first, not through forgiveness, but fatigue. He has shouted into the void long enough to hear his own echo return empty. It is in that quiet desolation that something subtle shifts, the beginning of awareness. At first, awareness feels like defeat. He mistakes it for weakness because it offers no control. Yet it is precisely this surrender that allows the psyche to see without distortion. The man who was once desperate for her gaze begins, for the first time, to look inward. He sees the pattern, how every woman who withdraws triggers the same collapse, how every silence feels like the same wound. The face changes, but the ache repeats. That repetition is not coincidence. It is unconscious design. The psyche repeats what it cannot yet integrate. Every ignored message, every unanswered call, every cold pause, each becomes the stage where the shadow rehearses its unhealed drama. The man believes he is reacting to her, but he is reacting to history. The mother who withheld approval, the early rejection that fractured self-worth, the internalized voice that whispered you are not enough unless you are wanted. The present woman merely activates what was already buried. This is how projection keeps the past alive. In Jungian terms, the anima becomes both muse and tormentor. When she gives attention, she heals the wound temporarily. When she withholds, the wound reopens. The man, unaware of this inner drama, blames her behavior instead of recognizing his psyche's script. Thus, the outer conflict is merely a reflection of the inner division, between the self that seeks wholeness and the ego that fears dissolution. But silence, unresisted, becomes medicine. When he stops trying to control her absence, he begins to encounter what she represented, not who she was. He sees that he never loved her simply as a person. He loved the feeling of being seen. He loved the reflection of his own potential, the image she awakened. Her withdrawal now compels him to reclaim it. What he sought in her was his own unlived self. That realization does not come gently. It arrives like a mirror cracking under truth. The psyche resists through guilt, through nostalgia, through self-pity. But these are the final defenses before awakening. Because once he admits that his suffering is not about her silence but his own disconnection, the outer narrative collapses. The story loses power, but meaning begins. He realizes that attention was never love, it was recognition. And recognition, to the unintegrated psyche, is survival. To no longer be seen is to confront the void of one's own insignificance. Yet within that void lies the potential for real autonomy. When the external mirror disappears, the only reflection left is consciousness itself. This is the birth of inner authority, the masculine principle purified of dependency. He begins to sense that the feminine is not his to control or conquer. She is an archetypal force that moves through him. In her silence, She becomes the image of the self, vast, impersonal, unyielding. She no longer exists to complete him but to awaken him. What once felt like rejection now feels like initiation into awareness. And as he contemplates this, something softens. The resentment dissolves into understanding. He no longer needs her to respond, because her silence has already spoken the truth he resisted. What terrified him most, being unseen, becomes his liberation. He can now exist without reflection. This is the beginning of individuation, the union of awareness and autonomy. You, as the silent one, may feel his shift before he names it. His energy calms, his need withdraws, his gaze steadies. He stops chasing what your absence once symbolized. He begins to face himself with the same depth you once carried. In that moment, the polarity realigns, no longer in dependency, but in mutual presence. Yet this reconciliation is not romantic. It is psychological. The feminine does not return to reward him. She returns, if she does, because he no longer needs her to define him. Love without projection becomes possible only when both have met their own shadow. Anything less is reenactment. When a man truly integrates the silence, he no longer fears it. He begins to understand that what she withheld was never cruelty. It was consciousness refusing to be consumed. Her absence was not rejection but reflection, calling him into wholeness. The man who can endure being unseen becomes the man who can truly see. This is the paradox of power. The less one seeks to control, the more one perceives. And perception, when freed from fear, becomes love, not as emotion, but as awareness. Love without awareness becomes addiction. Awareness without love becomes exile. Between those two poles, most relationships oscillate, endlessly seeking balance, endlessly repeating the same unconscious vows. The silence between them is not absence, but the invitation to end that repetition. It asks both to listen, not to each other, but to the part of themselves they keep projecting outward. For him, the silence begins to feel less like punishment and more like a mirror that doesn't move. There is nothing to conquer, nothing to persuade, nowhere to hide. He stands before the void that used to be her and finds his own outline emerging. The more he stops trying to fill it, the more it reveals. That is the paradox of growth. Emptiness, once accepted, starts to form meaning on its own. Jung wrote that wholeness is not achieved by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. The woman's silence becomes that darkness, the unspoken realm where he must meet what he abandoned. The ego fears it because silence offers no reassurance, no feedback loop to confirm its stories. But the deeper self begins to recognize its language. In the absence of sound, there is space for seeing. He starts to feel emotions he had exiled, sadness without defense, longing without demand. They arrive like forgotten children asking to be acknowledged. The instinct to suppress weakens. Control no longer serves him. What he once called strength now feels like rigidity. What he once called detachment now feels like fear. In the stillness, these inversions reveal themselves with surgical clarity. The feminine principle expressed through her silence becomes the teacher, not the soft, comforting mother, but the initiator, the dark, sovereign feminine that requires awareness instead of reaction. She does not soothe his insecurity, she reflects it until he can name it. She does not return affection to restore the past, she embodies distance to evoke consciousness. In her stillness, she says the only thing that ever heals, see yourself asterisk. To the undeveloped masculine, this looks like threat. To the awakening one, it becomes promise. The threat, you will lose the illusion of control. The promise, you will discover real power. Because the deeper fear beneath being ignored is not abandonment, it is annihilation of the false self. The ego believes that if it is not desired, it ceases to exist. But what ceases is only the mask. The persona collapses, and the authentic self begins to breathe underneath. Silence dismantles the scaffolding of identity until only essence remains. That essence cannot be ignored because it no longer depends on recognition. You may notice in such a man the quieting of performance, The humor once used to deflect now becomes genuine warmth. The charm that once concealed insecurity now carries presence. He stops speaking to be heard and starts listening to understand. This is the masculine reborn through the feminine's boundary. She did not save him. She stopped enabling his illusion. And yet she too is transformed. Her silence was not a game. It was her own individuation. In withdrawing, she faced her shadow, the impulse to fix, to please, to overextend. She learned that compassion without boundaries becomes self-erasure. In learning to withhold attention, she reclaimed power not as dominance, but as discernment. Her silence taught her the same lesson it taught him. Love without awareness destroys both. So they stand on opposite sides of an invisible threshold. Not enemies, not lovers, but mirrors finally aligned. Neither chases, neither hides. The polarity remains, but it is no longer fueled by fear. Instead, it moves through respect, the recognition that each is a world, not a wound to be filled. And still, the energy between them hums, quiet, potent, alive. He no longer needs to control it. She no longer needs to manage it. Awareness has replaced projection, and in that field, connection becomes possible. Yet even now, the silence does not end. It deepens, because what began as absence has become a kind of sacred space, the field in which individuality and intimacy coexist. There is no longer threat or promise, only presence, and in that presence, the ancient battle between need and fear dissolves. He once feared being unseen. Now he understands. To be unseen by another is not tragedy. To be unseen by oneself is. This is how the psyche completes its hidden journey. Through the mirror of another's withdrawal, the self returns home. When silence finally ceases to wound, it begins to speak. Not in words, but in clarity, the kind that does not require interpretation. The man who once sought affirmation through reaction now understands that connection cannot be maintained through control. The woman who once measured love by presence now realizes that absence, when conscious, carries its own form of intimacy. The polarity between them no longer oscillates between dependence and detachment. It becomes awareness meeting awareness. Yet before that peace arrives, there is one more descent, the confrontation with guilt. When the projections dissolve, both face the cost of their illusions. He sees how his desire to be desired made him manipulative without intending it, how his affection was often conditional, his pursuit a means of validation rather than union. She sees how her silence, though necessary, concealed pain, how withdrawal became both boundary and shield. They meet in recognition, not accusation. Awareness does not blame, it witnesses. The psyche, having traversed shadow and reflection, now seeks integration. This is the stage Jung described as the reconciliation of opposites, the inner marriage of animus and anima, masculine and feminine, doing and being. It is not romantic, it is alchemical. The masculine learns to hold, the feminine learns to remain open without losing form. Silence, once weapon, becomes container. Speech, once compulsion, becomes revelation. He no longer needs to be seen to exist. His presence becomes quiet, grounded, self-contained. The external world may ignore him, but his awareness no longer collapses in response. He has met the internal feminine, the voice that knows without speaking, that receives without grasping. Through that inner union, he discovers a paradoxical power, the ability to stay conscious amid uncertainty. This is real masculinity, not dominance, but depth. And she, having withdrawn into sovereignty, now feels something different rising, not control, but compassion untainted by dependency. Her silence was never meant to freeze the heart, only to cleanse it. It was the womb of renewal. By refusing to perform warmth for the undeserving, she purified her own capacity for love. She can now give without depletion, receive without fear. Her quiet no longer hides resentment, it holds discernment. Together or apart, their psyche is mirror and archetypal truth. Ignorance and obsession are twins. One cannot release what one still depends on for identity. But when projection dissolves, Love ceases to be a transaction of needs and becomes the meeting of awarenesses. The fear of being ignored transforms into the freedom of self-recognition. What was once chaos becomes coherence. He begins to see the world differently, not as something to conquer but to commune with. The same feminine principle he once externalized in women now appears in nature, in art, in silence itself. The anima no longer haunts him as absence. She inhabits him as intuition. His creativity returns. His expression deepens. He becomes a man who feels without fleeing feeling, who holds desire without being held by it. This is the threshold where consciousness becomes love. Not sentimental love, but the quiet recognition that all projection was an attempt to recover the lost parts of the self. The woman he once feared losing becomes a symbol of his own wholeness reclaimed. Her ignoring was not the wound, it was the doorway. And you, the silent one, sense this too. You see that his transformation was never your responsibility, yet your boundary was its catalyst. You were not his teacher or punishment, you were the mirror he could not break. In the archetypal field, both have served the same purpose: to restore balance between inner and outer, masculine and feminine, consciousness and unconsciousness. There are no victors in this kind of evolution, only witnesses. The old game of attention and withdrawal no longer holds meaning. What remains is awareness itself, quiet, precise, unafraid. The dance continues, but without distortion. They may meet again or never speak. The form no longer matters. The pattern has fulfilled its purpose. Because the deepest fear he faced was never hers to soothe. It was his own separation from himself. And once he met that fear without fleeing, she no longer needed to hold the silence for him. The psyche, having absorbed its projection, no longer requires an external actor to carry its lessons. There is nothing left to prove, nothing to win, nothing to lose. Only the stillness that remains when illusion ends, vast, steady, awake. She didn't need closure, she found clarity. He no longer blamed her, he met the woman inside himself. When awareness arrived, the story no longer had power, only meaning.